Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out to my presentation today and for coming out all week to this week of RSCA. It's really great to see all the great research that's being done around campus. Let's get right into it. So my undergraduate thesis is entitled Effective Rehearsal Techniques in the Middle School Band Room. So for any musicians and music educators out there today, I think we all know the importance of the rehearsal process and how it relates to learning music. Thinking back on my own experiences, one of my favorite rehearsal processes was for the symphonic band here at CSULB, and um, working through the harmony of one piece and getting the intonation just right, so that when we performed it, it was really amazing. Um, as I was sitting in those rehearsals, though, I found myself thinking, what if I was in front of the ensemble? What would I be talking about? And that led me to this research topic. I felt that rehearsing was kind of a weakness of mine, and that's one of the most important things that we have to do as music educators. When we get hired, we have to go in every single day and work with a traditional ensemble and rehearse them and get them to sound as good as possible. And I wanted to make sure that coming out of my undergraduate, that was one of my strengths. So I took it upon myself to do the research and find these best practices. After I settled on this topic, I had a conversation with my main mentor, my middle school band teacher, and he told me that rehearsing is like having a tool belt, and that the more you sit in a rehearsal as a participant, the more you watch rehearsals, just as an observer, and the more you rehearse yourself, the bigger that tool belt gets, and the more things you add to it. So I saw this research really at its core as a way of adding more things to the tool belt for not just me, but for anyone that wants to read the study, whether you're a veteran teacher or you're just getting into it like I am. So let's move on to the lit review. We have this broken down instructional strategies. These are more broad educational things that you can do within rehearsal setting or can be done within the traditional classroom setting. Um, so one of these was like modeling with an instrument or singing, um, having students play as a solo, something like that. And then we have rehearsal analyses, which are really quantitative looks into the rehearsal process. Um, the ones I found looked at like how many times a specific topic was talked about in a rehearsal. And while these studies are great and they serve an amazing purpose, they weren't really what I was looking for in for my research. I wanted my research to be more qualitative and look at some of the specific techniques and what makes a conductor effective. So getting into that in effective conductors, this really talks about the speed with which a conductor may move through rehearsal or move through certain topics. Um, and it also effective can also look into the teaching and how well students are learning and responding to that feedback. And then very few studies talked about specific feedback techniques, which I thought was something that might be need to be addressed. Some of the context they were talking about too was maybe not traditional ensembles. One of my favorite studies that I read was about a songwriting class and how feedback was given within those classes, which is great and serves an amazing purpose, just not what I was looking for. So my research questions are: what feedback techniques are used most often by master teachers? And we're looking at the most common methods, what makes each so strong, and where can they be improved? So for my methodology, I would have loved to go into a classroom and worked with a teacher and talk to students and sit through an entire rehearsal process. But realistically, in the days of COVID-19, that's not really possible. So I settled for this interview process instead, um, where I interviewed three amazing master band teachers from across the state of California, um, which are George, Charlie, and Robin. So George is a middle school band and choir teacher from Northern California. Charlie is a middle and high school band teacher from Central California, and Robin is a middle school band and orchestra teacher from Southern California. I wanted to get a variety of locations for these um, participants because I didn't want everyone to have the same influences when they were coming up in school or even now. Um, like if everyone that I interviewed came from CSCLB, we probably all have similar approaches to how band should be rehearsed. So getting that variety was really important to me. Um, in the interview, I had an hour-long interview with each participant, and I asked them some introductory questions up front about their background, about the school that they teach at, and the students that they work with. And then I went into these scenarios that I had drawn up that were scenarios that they might run into in a traditional, in a normal band rehearsal. One of these was if your second alto player keeps playing F sharps, even though it's written as an F natural, how would you approach the situation in class? Or if you have a really over enthusiastic percussionist that's playing too loud, how would you get them to play softer while still keeping that energy where you want it? And so getting into that, I had four main topics for my results, which are whole ensemble engagement. And everyone had a similar take on this when talking about whole ensemble engagement, that if everyone in the room is focused on the same topic, it's more likely to help with classroom management issues. Because if you're only working with one section, like if you're only working with the flutes on this one melody, the low brass players are pretty likely to be screwing around in the back row. And that's not a great thing in middle school. So if you have them all focused, that's a really good thing. Charlie even talked about in his interview about how as middle schoolers they're developing musicians, and if they're all focused on the same thing, they all need similar things to focus on in their musical growth, or they could all focus on the same thing and still grow, where that may not be the case in an older ensemble. And then we moved into forecasting information, which is something George and Charlie talked about at length. And this is a way of preparing material before passing the piece out to the students. So you can work with the rhythm or the melody or some of the harmonic elements of the piece with the students before ever passing out the piece. That way, when the piece does eventually get passed out, they're more likely to be successful on that sight read. And I'll get more into that later. Then we have the importance of reflection that George and Robin talked about, and they record their ensembles fairly frequently. And I know George in particular will compare his ensemble to others. So he'll choose like 3 other middle schools playing this piece and ask them, you know, what did this group do well that we didn't? Or what did we do well in our recording that this group didn't? How can we improve our performance or make our group sound like this really spectacular group? And he talked about how they have individual journals that they will write in and document their progress. Robin talked about it as sort of a class discussion in a way to engage everyone. And I think both of these methods could work really well and could work really well in tandem. And then intonation, as we're looking at the next slide, this is what my paper would have looked like. And actually that picture that you're seeing, that's a screenshot of one of the transcripts from the interviews that I had. So for intonation, George talked a lot about singing, teaching choir, actually the only one in the group that teaches choir. He knows how valuable singing can be in developing pitch and developing ear. George is also a brass player, and brass players know that when you sing something, you're more likely to hear it, and if you're hearing it in tune, you're more likely to play it in tune. He also talked about using drones and tuning to individual ensemble members. We're really developing the ear. Charlie talked about a similar approach for using drones to establish pitch. He said that his students, when they come into his program, they may not know what an in-tune concert F or an in-tune concert B flat sounds like on their instrument. So when he uses a drone, that's always going to be right down the middle on pitch. That really helps them zero in on, okay, this is what being in tune sounds like. Robin had a much different approach than the other two. She actually has tuners on the individual stands, and this is something that George and Charlie actually warned against. They said it allows students to tune more with their eyes instead of with their ears. Robin said, well, she understands this. It's a good way to help students play in tune, but she also does exercises to develop their ear. One of my favorites that she mentioned was this exercise where she had a violin and she'd be playing a double stop on the same note and slowly move one of the strings out of tune, and the students would raise their hand when that pitch went out of tune, and then when she brought it back, they'd lower their hands as a way to make sure everyone's on the same page of what in tune sounds like and what out of tune sounds like. So for the discussion, I really just kind of compared the 3 answers to each given theme and talked about how they could all work together, much in the same way that I did about intonation. And then I also added in the topic, which was specific comments, and I broke it down based on the responses to the interview questions. One of my favorites was a balance exercise that Charlie brought up, where I posed the scenario of these trumpet players that are playing really loud and overpowering let's say flutes and clarinets that are on a shared melody. And I asked how he'd approach that. And so he said he would take one of the trumpet players with the flutes and the clarinets and play through the melody. And then he would add in each sequential trumpet player, like go second chair, then third chair, then fourth chair, all the way down the line. And I thought this was a really great idea because not only are you layering in and getting students to listen for balance, but you're also allowed a chance to hear each student individually, which is something so rare in a normal rehearsal setting. And especially in middle school where these students are developing maybe at different rates. So you get to hear how each student may be developing in their progress. So in doing my research after I finished the discussions, I realized something was missing. So I added in a new chapter, which I called applications. I really wanted my research to be practical and to be applicable within the classroom. So I took two of these main approaches, which are intonation and forecasting information, and made them into exercises that could be used in the classroom as soon as tomorrow. So for forecasting information, I took this piece by Frank Kelly entitled Joy, which is a grade 2, which is pretty typical for a medium to advanced middle school ensemble, and looked at the melodic and rhythmic elements of the piece. So this rhythm that I took is actually a 3/2 hemiola, which could present some challenges for a younger middle school ensemble. And it's something that can be worked on in the whole ensemble. You could apply articulations to this, you could apply scales to this, or you can have everyone play it on just the same note and work out that rhythm and do some clapping and some counting to develop students' rhythmic skills. And then for this melodic element, what made this so interesting, so the way I did it is that everyone would be playing the same thing in a range that's comfortable for them, so it would just sound like a unison, which is something interesting for, let's say, low brass players. Tuba players in middle school ensembles typically just play whole notes on the tonic and the dominant. So they're playing something more melodic that makes it more interesting for them and may be a way for them to inspire them to stay in music if they're playing more melodic stuff like this. Also, this melody, Kelly lists as melody 1 in Joy, which means it's pretty important. So if students are hearing this before they play it in a sight read, they're more likely to hear it in that sight read and know that it's important and maybe back down so that they can hear more of it. So in conclusion, I think lots more research should be done on this topic. I think research should be done in the classroom throughout a rehearsal cycle like I had planned to do, but it can be done with multiple teachers. And I think the most important thing about this is to talk to students. The student input on this is huge and it isn't really widely talked about. I think students provide a really interesting insight into how the rehearsal process is run and how different feedback techniques are interpreted. Secondly, I noticed throughout this research that these participants gave really amazing strategies to work through, and they gave really insightful ways to help their students improve. And I was expecting just kind of one-off comments about, oh, this will be a quick fix to help them get better. But the level of care that went into these strategies that these participants described showed how much they care about their students and how much they care about their students' development as musicians, which to me was really inspiring and made me really excited to get back in a rehearsal space and work with students. Lastly, and I think most importantly, no one size fits all. So it's feasible that you could take these strategies into a middle school classroom on Monday and try all of them out and none of them could work. But at the very least, in listening to my presentation today and in reading the paper, if you want to, you'll have things to add to the tool belt for your rehearsal processes and more ways to help students improve in the future, even if it's not right now. Thank you everyone for coming out.